Good afternoon, everyone, once again, and thank you for joining. I'm Davina Gowden, the Communications Coordinator here at RPRA, and welcome to RPRA's webinar on the proposed 2022 RRCEA Program Fee Consultation. Today's session is one of two where we'll walk through the proposal and have dedicated time to answer your questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the slides and the recording will be available on our website later this week. As I've mentioned, today's webinar will also be about answering your questions. So to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your question or comment and click send. There is an upvote or a like feature where you can like another person's question. You'll see once there are questions in the queue that there will be a thumbs up, and you can click that thumbs up to like it and it'll move it up the queue to be answered. You'll also see that in this presentation, we have a few dedicated slides where we will stop and answer questions, and we'll be trying to organize and respond to your questions based on the topics that we cover in that specific question. So if you notice that you've submitted a question and it's not been answered, it may be because it makes sense to ask it in a later section. So please stay tuned for that. We also have quite a few participants in this webinar. So it is possible that we won't get to all the questions during the allotted time. And if that is the case, we will follow up with you after the webinar. Once again, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with this presentation deck later this week. If you miss anything or want to revisit the information, it will be available on our consultation page. So joining me today is Noah Gitterman and Stacy Bowman. They'll be our panelists for today, and I'll hand it off to you, Noah, to get us started. Thanks.
Thanks, Davina. So why don't we go straight to our first slide. Well, I should say, for folks who don't know me, I'm Noah Gitterman. I'm Chief of Strategic Initiatives here at RPRA, so I'll be talking about the fees proposal that we posted. And Stacy's one of my colleagues that has helped prepare the proposal. So we always start these webinars with a little bit about who we are. Sometimes we have totally new programs, and so we're interacting on these webinars with totally new groups of producers and associations. But sometimes we have people who, even in existing programs, who are unfamiliar with RPRA. So we always do a little bit of context setting. Our organization is mandated to administer the RRCEA and its accompanying regulations and the WDTA. So at a high level, the RRCEA and WDTA set up a framework for transitioning from legacy waste diversion programs, winding them up, and implementing new producer responsibility resource recovery programs under the RRCEA. So right now, all of the legacy programs have wound up or are winding up. And we have, in 2022, a full complement of new producer responsibility programs under the RRCEA. So we're tires program, batteries, electronics, MHSW, have ceased operating, and the Blue Box program is on its way to winding up over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more background about RPRA and fee paying. Producers are obligated under our RRCEA regulations to register with RPRA and to report annually with RPRA. And so the registry is our online platform for collecting the information we need to collect under the regulations we administer. For some of the programs, producers are already registering and reporting through the electronic registry, through specific electronic registry portals we built for them. For Blue Box and HSP, those portals are still under development. They're getting developed right now, and they should be online this year to handle producer reporting for 2022. As an administrative authority, we're created by statute, but we're not part of government. We don't receive any government funding. And so all of our funding, all of our operations are funded through fees that we charge to regulated parties strictly on a cost recovery basis. And we charge fees under both the WDTA and the RRCEA. The WDTA, there are monthly cost recovery charges to the IFOs and stewardship organizations under that statute. So this consultation is not about the WDTA fees. Under the RRCEA, we charge fees for two kinds of programs: the producer responsibility resource recovery programs, so Blue Box, HSP, tires, batteries, ITTAV, and lighting. We also have two programs where we are operating a digital registry service for the ministry, and that's excess soil and hazardous waste. Excess soil is up and running in 2022, so we are collecting fees under that program in 2022. Hazardous waste is still in development, but will be up and running as of January 1st, 2023. So when we come out and set fees for 2023, we will also be setting fees for that hazardous waste program. As part of this consultation, we're focused on the producer responsibility programs. So tires, batteries, ITTAV, lighting, HSP, and Blue Box. Excess oil fees have already been set. They were set last fall. And as mentioned, the hazardous waste fees will come into play next year. So the fees that we charge cover all our operating costs. So that includes the compliance and enforcement for our producer responsibility programs, and all of the support that requires, including communications, finance, and other activities. Next slide, please. So again, our consultation proposal now is focused on the producer responsibility programs and setting 2022 fees. So when producers come in and report under each of the programs listed at the top of the slide, this consultation is proposing the fees that they will pay to RPRA. The consultation is also covering a couple of, or at least includes information about a couple of other things. So one is, we'll talk a little bit about our fee setting policy, which is getting some clarifying updates to it, or we're proposing some clarifying updates to it. And also outline our cost allocation methodology for 2022 later on in the presentation. And again, during this consultation, we're not focused on the WDTA side of things, and we're not focused on the fees for our digital reporting or digital registry services, either excess oil or hazardous waste. Next slide, please. So we thought it would be helpful just to take a step back and look at you know, at a high level what our approach to fee setting is. And our starting point is our general fee setting policy. So that's a policy that's posted on our website, first developed in 2018, which sets out principles that guide the board in setting fees for each of our programs. Guided by that policy, there are sort of four main steps to developing the fee proposal that we've posted for consultation. So the starting point is always our annual budget. So that's set out in the business plan, which was published at the end of last year, covering including a budget for 2022 and forecast for 2020 for 23 and 24. That plan was consulted on with our Industry Advisory Council and Service Provider Advisory Group in 2021. And so that's the starting point for our fee proposal. The next step is our cost allocation methodology. So taking that annual budget and using our methodology to allocate cost recovery budgets to each of our programs. So we'll talk a little bit about how that works later on. So the next step after that is once we've got a cost recovery target for our programs, we have a fee model that determines the fee that the obligated parties will pay in each of those programs, including which parties pay. And then the final step after the fee model is established is finalizing fee model inputs. So that's what goes into the fee model to spit out a fee rate. So one part of that fee model is obviously the cost recovery allocation to that program from step 2. But there are other inputs as well, including because our model focuses on amount of material supplied by producers. Our estimates about volume are one of the fee model inputs. Surpluses and deficits from prior years are another input. And so those get added to the fee model, and that helps determine our fee rate, which you see in the fee schedules, and that we'll get to later on. Next slide, please. So a little bit different this year was that in the fall, we procured an outside consultant to help conduct a third-party review of how we set our fees. And we ended up procuring Optimus SBR to do that review. They looked at, they did a jurisdictional scan of comparator organizations to help provide some context around best practices for fee setting. They assessed step 2 and step 3 in the sort of 4-step approach I outlined earlier. So they looked at the cost allocation model and our fee model. And they also looked at our general fee setting policy. So at a high level, the review concluded that our policy, our fee setting principles were consistent with best practices, although they've suggested some refinements to those principles, primarily to kind of clarify and simplify them. They concluded that our cost allocation methodology was reasonable and that our fee model our proposed fee model was also reasonable. We posted the executive summary from that review on our website under the along with the other consultation materials. And I should say, I forget if Davina mentioned this, this presentation will also be posted on the website. So if you see there's some links in here, you'll be able to click on them once once this deck gets posted. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the consultation process. Our statute requires us to consult on RRCEA fees for 45 days. And then the fees need to be posted once they're finalized for 30 days before they come into force. We've started this consultation on March 10th, and it will end on April 25th. We encourage feedback. And so there's an email address you see on the screen to provide written feedback. You can also submit questions to us if I don't get to them during this presentation, or if you need something clarified, or my answers were unclear, you can submit questions to the same address. We have the 2 webinars. There was one yesterday. There's the one we're doing right now. The one yesterday focused on tires, batteries, and ITTAV and lighting fees. So this one focuses on Blue Box and HSP. Once the consultation period is over, then our board sets the final fees. We do a consultation report summarizing all the feedback we've received and the responses we've provided. That report is part of the package of material that our board sees before they finalize fees. And we also post it to our website once the consultation is over. So you'll see the consultation report as well. And then we'll communicate with folks who participated in the consultation at the webinars, and directly with producers who need to report to us once fees are finalized and our registry is open for them to do their annual reporting to us. And again, everything's on our website, including timelines and other things. Next slide, please. So I think I'll talk briefly about our fee setting policy. So I think I mentioned it was first established in 2018 before we set fees for tires, which was the first program to transition over to the RRCEA. It really sets out principles that kind of guide the board in setting fees. Optimists, our outside consultant, recommended some changes to the policy, really to sort of reduce redundancy, make it clearer and simpler, and enable some flexibility, especially because our mandate expanded from 2018, because we're now charging fees under the RRCEA, not just for producer responsibility programs, but also for the digital registry services, excess oil and hazardous waste. So you can see our proposed new policy is posted online. And I think, Davina, if you go to the next slide, we've got a table that's focused on that at a high level, the changes we're making to the different principles. So on the left side are the current list of principles. We have, I think they are all taken from an OECD guide to best practices for regulatory fee setting. And on the right is sort of our proposed condensed and clarified principles. Again, not making big substantive changes to how we approach fee making, but just trying to make our guidance a bit clearer and simpler. And there's more detail you can about these principles in the actual policy posted online. So I'm going to propose not to go into detail about each of these, but if folks have questions, I can answer them. Next slide, please. Oh, and here we are at our first question stop. So if anyone has questions about the process I outlined at the beginning, or specifically about the policy.
So we just have one question so far, Noah, and it's the person is asking, is the April 30th supply data submit due date going to be pushed out to a later date?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, it will be pushed out. So you will not be required to report by April 30th. For Blue Box and HSP producers, in 2021, because we didn't get the regulations finalized until I think it was sometime in June, we implemented what we described as sort of a manual registration process involving filling out Excel spreadsheets. We are now developing the registry portal for Blue Box and HSP. And we very much want to do the Blue Box and HSP producer reporting through the registry portal once it's built. It's very sort of resource intensive for us to run the manual process. It'll be a lot easier for us and easier for producers to do it through the registry. So for Blue Box and HSP, we are planning on launching later this year, planning on launching the reporting campaign later this year once those two registries are finished. And you will receive a lot of communication from us about that once we're ready to announce when those dates are. So don't worry, you will hear from us, and we will find you to let you know what you have to do and when. But yeah, you won't be required to come in on April 30th. I'm kind of assuming you're a Blue Box or HSP producer until later this year. For tires, batteries, and ITTAV and lighting producers, those schedules are also pushed out a bit, mostly to accommodate the fee setting process. Their registries are already built. Well, I should say lighting in their regulation will be happening later this year as well. Tires and batteries and ITTAV will be happening a little bit later than set out in the regulation, but again, we will be communicating with them to make sure that everyone's aware of what their reporting deadlines are.
Great, thank you, Noah. We don't seem to have any other questions right now, but I do encourage participants to still be putting questions in the chat. There will be another opportunity to ask questions later in this presentation. We do have one more that just came in, and there is a question about 2021 data. Does it still need to be submitted to Stewardship Ontario?
That's a good question. Stewardship Ontario is has recently consulted on, so let me step back. So at a high level, the Stewardship Ontario Blue Box program is still running, still operating. So as a Stewardship Ontario steward, you still have obligations to SO. Stewardship Ontario has proposed amendments to the wind-up plan to simplify the steward reporting process. I encourage you to reach out to Stewardship Ontario to get the latest updates on when that revised approach to steward reporting will get implemented. So as a result of the proposal, which I believe the River Board has supported already, it would remove the requirement for additional steward reporting to Stewardship Ontario later this year. But exactly when that will come into effect, you should reach out to SO to get the latest information. So I think it's, I don't know offhand whether there will still have to be one other round of steward reporting to SO before the changes, before the simplified process comes into effect. But SO is the best place to get the latest info about that.
Perfect, thanks, Noah. So now we're going to move on to the next slide.
Okay, so now after all that about process, we're getting into the numbers. So again, I mentioned at the beginning, we start with RPRA's budget. So this is RPRA's cost recovery target for 2022. So the biggest piece of that is the producer responsibility programs. So again, tires, batteries, ITTAV, and lighting, Blue Box and HSP. Another proportion of that are the fees that we charge to the WDTA programs. And then there are, on this slide, referred to as the EPA programs. Those are those two digital registry service programs, excess soil and hazardous waste. So over time, if you've been paying attention in other in past fee consultations, sort of the proportion of the budget going to RRCEA programs has increased, and the digital registry service ones, and the proportion going to the WDTA programs has decreased. Next slide, please. So here's a table summarizing some of the year-over-year changes. So again, compared to our 2021 recovery targets, we're seeing a reduction in the WDTA cost recovery and an corresponding increase in the RRCEA program recovery. Then there's additional RRCEA cost recovery targets relating to new programs, particularly lighting in 2022. This just sets some context around kind of the changes in our budget and the relative proportion coming from WDTA and RRCEA. So as RRCEA's budget is increasing, the WDTA side is decreasing, and we're also absorbing new programs at the same time. Next slide, please. The next step after we have our budget is our cost allocation methodology. So this year we've updated and revised our cost allocation methodology. If you were participating in the consultation last year, you would have heard of refer to the program weight approach to allocating costs to the different producer responsibility programs. We have sort of refined that approach to apply more quantitative factors to divide up our shared costs among the different programs. Although at a high level, the methodology is the same. We start with direct expenses. So the biggest component of the direct expense to each program is related to the registry. So the capital cost for the registry build is amortized over 10 years. So there is an annual amortization and interest related to the registry components. And so for each program, that would include the cost for that program's own portal, plus foundational or common costs that are shared among all the programs. And the common costs are essentially divided equally among the programs. So whenever a program comes online, it will end up sort of contributing the same amount to the registry common costs, and then funding its own portal build. Then we've got costs that are shared or common to programs. And this is the biggest bundle of costs. And that includes indirect costs, which are costs that are incurred equally across all the programs. Things like running our website and communications and IT expenses, some of our payroll. And then we have a bucket of shared service expenses. So the shared services are shared among all programs, but typically shared in proportion to the number of fee-paying producers or the number of registrants in the program. So the indirect costs typically shared equally across the programs. The shared service expenses shared in different amounts depending on the program. And under shared expenses, we have again some registry-specific IT resources that might sort of depend on the number of registrants in the program, and some of our payroll. So for example, the compliance officers and registry support officers are shared, are in part shared based on how much that program needs to be serviced, either through the number of producers or number of registrants. We don't, it was maybe helpful to note that we don't have program-specific departments at RPRA, and the reason for that is so we can be more efficient in how we deliver services. So across most of our functions, staff work across programs, and in particular, if you're looking at our frontline sort of compliance and registry support officers, they are typically working across all our programs. And that helps us be a lot more efficient than we would be if we had to sort of staff up specific departments for each of the programs. In part, that's because the need for the program sort of varies throughout the year, right? We have different reporting frequencies, different sort of a different pace of compliance campaigns, different focus with respect to registry procedures throughout the year. So that allows us to apply resources where they're needed on sort of a variable basis. Next up is contributions to our organizational reserve. So each program contributes to our reserve based on a proportionate share of total expenses that we recover from the program. Our reserve is capped under our operating agreement with the ministry, so it can't be more than 50% of our operating costs. but there is a proportion in our budget that is going to the reserve in 2022. We're not at that limit. And there are some startup costs from when RPRA first came into being back in late 2016, 2017 that get allocated across the program. So that's at a high level how our cost allocation methodology works. Again, we revised this method from the program weight approach, and the revisions really applied to mostly applied to steps 2 and 3. So we developed a more sort of granular and quantitative approach across our entire budget to make sure that we're allocating costs in the right place. Next slide, please. So this is the results of that work, and you'll see our cost recovery targets and how they're allocated out. Lighting, tires, ITTAV and batteries, HSP, and Blue Box. And again, lighting is the new program in 2022, taking a new share of the overall budget. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into, so now we're in step 3 of the overall approach, which is our fee model, right? So we looked at our budget. We looked at our cost allocation methodology to get our cost recovery targets for each program. Now we're looking at our fee model, which helps spit out that fee schedule we'll get to in a little bit. So in 2022, we're proposing to use the same fee model that we used in 2020 and 2021. So that means we assess a variable rate based on material supply, so units for tire producers, kilograms, and the other programs for larger producers, and then a flat fee below a de minimis threshold for smaller producers. The flat fee is the same across the programs, although the threshold is unique to the program. We are proposing a change to the flat fee itself. So we're proposing to increase it from $75 to $100 this year. And that's really just to reflect that flat fee hasn't increased since 2018, even though our budget has. And so we're now proposing an increase to that fee, and that, again, that's the same across all of the programs. This model was reviewed by Optimus SBR, and they assessed that it was a reasonable approach that aligned with our principles. In particular, the approach or this fee model that we're proposing promotes our equity principle, protects small producers from excessive burden, ensures that large producers pay fees that reflect how much they're supplying into Ontario, and also helps ensure that because it's for those larger producers where it's a per kilogram or per unit rate, that no producer has a competitive advantage on in the same material category because of RPRA's fee. And it's simple and predictable for us to apply compared to some other approaches. The per kilogram fee aligns with information producers are required to report to us under the regulations. We have and are able to develop, I guess, over time, reliable revenue estimates, because we'll have a good handle on future supply once these programs are up. Next slide, please. So I think there's more detail on this slide about the actual fee model. I may hold off on some of this detail until we get to it in the fee schedules. Maybe easier to talk about it in the context of the particular schedules for Blue Box and HSP. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Davina. We did look at some other options with help from our consultant. One option that we considered was a flat fee model. So again, right now we have a flat fee for small producers, but larger producers above that threshold pay a rate based on volume of supply. So we looked at what a flat fee model across the board would do. And in particular, we looked at sort of a three-tiered model that would have a small, medium, and large flat fee. We are not recommending that for 2022, in large part because the model shifts substantial cost from larger producers to smaller ones, creating, in our view, an undue shift in burden. It also potentially distorts the playing field because unit costs would no longer be the same across competitors in the same material group. So on a unit or volume basis, larger producers would be paying less than smaller or medium producers. We also looked at potentially shifting from per kilogram to per unit rates for all of our programs. So again, right now we have a per kilogram rates for all of our programs except per tire rate in the tires program. But we are not proposing that for 2022, in large part because that a unit-based approach increases complexity because we don't have a common definition of units in, especially for those programs where that have multiple material groups like Blue Box and HSP, and relatedly potentially reduces equity because again, costs would depend on units, and we don't have a common unit definition across all the materials that are sharing in that program's costs. The final model we looked at was what we were referring to as an amalgamated fee model. So that would combine all of the producer responsibility program costs into one bucket rather than allocating them among the programs. Theory behind that is sort of recognizing that our approach to implementing or operating each of these programs is relatively the same, and would reflect that sort of a producer in one program sort of situated similarly to a producer in another program. We are still committed to considering that approach in the future, but we weren't ready to, or I should say we're not proposing it for 2022 because we need more time and data to really understand the impact on individual producers, and wait until we have until we're until RPRA is in a more stable operating state. So we're state where we're no longer sort of taking on new programs every year, but in a more stable state where we can understand impacts a bit better across all our programs and understand better how the programs are operating on a stable basis through the year. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think coming up is our fee schedule. So starting with blue box. So again, the schedule looks similar to the structure of it is similar to last year's. There's a flat fee for producers with 50,000 kilograms or less. I believe that threshold is the same as what was set last year. The fee is increased from $75 to $100. And then for larger producers, we're proposing the 0.44 cents per kilogram rate. So that is an increase from the 2021 rate. There was no material deficit or surplus from that we're predicting from 2021. So we're not proposing any adjustments to that base rate for surplus or deficit. I think our volume estimates are have maybe increased a bit, but roughly in line with what they were last year. And so that increase in the base fee rate reflects in large part the increase in our that RRCEA or producer responsibility part of the RPRA budget. Next slide, please. So this is the structure for HSP. At a high level, the structure is the same, again, the same as what it was last year. So it's a bit more complicated than some of the other programs because of the nature of the categories of material covered by the HSP reg. So like last year, we are treating categories C, D, and E that are obligated under the reg differently. And that's because they're treated very differently in the regulation. So the regulatory burden on them is much less. And they also aren't obligated to report supply information to RPRA. So for those categories, it's just a flat fee based on a targeted collection, cost recovery collection of $200,000 for those three categories, for those three programs. They also have a de minimis carve out based on a revenue figure rather than a supply volume figure. And then categories A and B are treated similarly to the other producer responsibility programs because their regulatory obligations are structured in a similar way. So we've got the $100 flat fee under that threshold and a per kilogram fee this year proposing 1.5 cents per kilogram. I think on the next slide, Davina, we have some more detail, about some more detail about the proposal. So consistent with what we did in 2021, the revenue collect from category C, D, and E is adjusted downward. That was an assessment we actually did last year to reflect sort of the final regulation and the level of effort required to implement those programs. There is an increase proposed in the rates for category C and D. And the reasons for those increases are because there are fewer obligated producers in those categories than we predicted in 2021. So again, those are flat fee rates. So to meet our cost recovery target, they depend on the number of producers paying those rates. And in the Mercury category, category C, I think there were about half as many producers were estimating in that category than we estimated last year. And in category D, again, fewer producers that we're estimating are out there than we thought there would be last year when we started the program up. The base fee rate for categories A and B, I think, is going from, it says 12% on this page. So I think it's from, if I'm remembering right, 1.3 cents a kilogram to 1.5 cents a kilogram. Again, largely a result of that increasing proportion of the RPRA budget moving from the WDTA side to the producer responsibility side. Our estimates around volume, I think, are at the bottom of the page there. And I think we are holding our estimates around volume steady. So the same volume estimates we made last year, we're expecting in 2022. Again, because the program is new, we don't have, we are still learning about what the total tonnage that is obligated under the program. So if our estimates are off, either too high or too low, they're likely not too high. Sorry, they're likely not too low. Any sort of difference between what we expected to collect and what we actually collect will get wrapped up into fee setting in future years. So that's the same with all of our programs. So with all of our programs, you know, there's always going to be some difference between the revenue we collected and what our actual spend was compared to our target. But there are also differences in what we expected our revenue to be and what we actually collected through the reporting process. Because our estimates can't be absolutely accurate to the kilogram, and especially with new programs, it's a bit harder to get a precise number until we've done a year or two of verification of supply. And so again, we're sort of holding that volume estimate steady for 2022. If there's some discrepancy, if that estimate is too high, that will get trued up in future years. Next slide, please. So here are the schedules, just in summary level, for the other material groups. Again, you'll see the structures are the same across the programs. Each of the programs is seeing some, lighting is a new program. Tires and ITT and batteries are seeing, also seeing a fee rate increase. We explained yesterday that the ITT AV and batteries increase is on a percentage basis more than the other programs, and that's in large part because the amount of material, the volume of material obligated under the program is substantially less than what we had originally predicted when the program was up and running. And so we needed to reduce our volume estimates, and relatedly, there's a deficit carryover in that material group that we need to recover. maybe also worth pointing out in the tires, there was actually a surplus, or we're predicting a surplus carryover from 2021. So their base rate gets reduced to that 14.1 cents per tire because of the surplus carryover. Again, those kinds of details are they were in the presentation yesterday, and they'll be online if you need to see them. Next slide, please. So now we're at questions.
Yes, we have quite a few questions. The first is a comment. So this participant is asking for next time if we could split Blue Box and HSP in future seminars, and we'll take that into consideration moving forward. Noah, was there anything that you wanted to add about why Blue Box and HSP are together in this webinar?
No, that's a helpful suggestion. I think, we're trying to be efficient with producers' time and with our time, but that's helpful feedback, and we'll keep note of that for when we do our next round of consultations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. There's another question here. You note that the fees are based on approximately 1,350 producers, but on RPRA's list of registered producers, there are 925 registered. What accounts for this difference? I think this is referring to Blue Box.
Right, yeah. So the differences between, so the number of producers on the website is who has registered so far, and the estimate is our estimate of the number of producers that are still out there to bring into the system. So when we find producers that haven't yet registered, even though they're obligated to, well, I should say as a starting point, it's obviously a big focus of our program is on making sure that there aren't free riders out there. So we're very much focused on getting producers registered, paying the RPRA fee, but also participating in the collection and management systems that need to get set up. We take a risk-based approach to how we focus on compliance generally. There's actually a risk-based compliance framework on our website, but in particular with registrations, especially for new programs, that means in part means we're focused on making sure that we get the vast majority of the supply volume out there into the system as quickly as we can. And so we're, to the extent there's a discrepancy there between the number of producers we think are out there and what our estimate is, because we're working our way through to get those remaining producers into the system, again, on a priority basis. So if we know that there are high priority producers that haven't registered first, we'll look at getting those, focusing on those first to get them into the system, to make sure they're paid up both for last year and this year, and participating in the resource recovery performance obligations.
Thanks, Noah. There's another question here related to HSP. So why are the category C producers paying a fee based on revenue when mercury containing products have not been made or sold in over 10 years?
Yeah, so that's a function of the regulatory program of the obligations under the regulation, which obligate mercury producers who produced mercury containing devices in the past. And they have obligations to make sure that mercury containing devices get collected and managed in particular cases. And there are some reporting obligations to RPRA, although there isn't a supply reporting obligation because those devices aren't currently being supplied into Ontario, but there are reporting obligations, so we can track to make sure that they're collecting that material when it has to be collected and managing it properly. So I hope that answers the question, but the starting point is the obligations under the regulation.
Great, thank you, Noah. There's another question here that asks, where does environmental impact of the commodity play into the fee schedule determination / setting or current recycling rates of producers?
So environmental impact and current recycling rates aren't explicitly incorporated into our fee model. Again, the fee model is focused on the amount of material that's getting supplied into the province, essentially, and trying to trying to focus on our fee setting principles of equity and simplicity by applying that volume-based fee rate. The may be helpful to note that the RPRA fee itself is really a small component of the overall resource recovery obligations that producers have under these regulations. So most of the incentives kind of around relating to environmental impact and waste reduction and resource recovery efficiency will come from the costs of actually operating that collection and management system, and not the RPRA fee, which is sort of a small component of the overall resource recovery costs under these programs.
Perfect, thank you. We have a clarification question here about RPRA's fees. Is the RPRA fee additional to the Stewardship Ontario fee or a part of it?
Sorry, Davina, could you repeat that?
Sure, no problem. Is the RPRA fee additional to the Stewardship Ontario fee, or is it a part of it?
It's additional. So it's two different reporting regimes. For Stewardship Ontario, you're paying a fee to run the WDTA Blue Box program, which is winding up. To RPRA, you're paying a fee to support our operations in implementing the new regulatory program, which is ramping up under the RRCEA. So the RPRA fee is different from the Stewardship Ontario fee. Now, the amount of fees that RPRA is still overseeing the Stewardship Ontario program, but as we showed in one of the earlier slides, the amount of our budget that is recovered from the WDTA programs is decreasing substantially as those programs start to wind up. And our cost recovery now mostly comes from the RRCEA side, but they are still separate programs. Eventually, the Blue Box program will cease operating completely and SO will wind itself up. There'll be no more obligations to SO after.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question here about HSP. Will Category E have a flat fee in 2022?
So the short answer is yes. Maybe, I don't know, Davina, if it's easy just to pull up the HSP schedule. So Category E has a flat fee. That fee is we're proposing is the same as last year, I believe. There are increases to CND for the reasons I described earlier. I think maybe in response to an earlier question about the revenue cutoffs for category C. So what's a bit different with C, D, and E is that we wanted to, for equity reasons, to still have what we call sort of a small producer threshold, where we can implement that $100 flat fee. We don't have supply numbers for C, D, and E, so we can't, like in the other programs, we can't use a volume threshold for that $100 flat fee. So for C, D, and E, we use an annual revenue threshold, so under $2 million. And that's consistent with what we implemented last year. For producers with annual revenue under $2 million, your flat fee will be $100 rather than the fees that you see in the rows for category CD. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Noah. We have one more question about reporting extensions, and when will RPRA be announcing those reporting extensions?
I think the best way I can put it is you will know well in advance of when you need to do it, or I should say you will know, we will give you enough time to get ready to report to us. We aren't ready for Blue Box and HSP. We aren't, we aren't ready to announce those dates right now, but that's just because we want to make sure that our registry portal development is on schedule for you guys to come in. But as soon as we know, you folks will know, and it's in very much in Ripper's interest to make sure you folks are given enough time to come in and do the reporting you need to do. So you will definitely hear from us when it's time to start thinking about reporting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Noah. And that's all of our questions. But before we end this webinar, we are just going to be taking a quick pause. This will only take a few minutes of everyone's time. I'm just going to be launching a poll. We do this for all our sessions, and we just want to help learn and gain feedback from our stakeholders and potentially improve our webinars. So please just take a few minutes to complete these 4 questions. It would really be appreciated. And I'll leave it open for a few more minutes. Okay, just a few more seconds and then I'm going to close it. Perfect. Thank you everyone for taking the time to do that and for asking questions, and Noah for answering the questions. We'll just go on to our next slide here about next steps.
Yeah, so next steps is that we are open to your feedback and your questions up until April 25th. We encourage you as much as possible to give us your feedback as early as you can. This presentation plus a recording and the presentation yesterday and the recording will be on our consultation webpage, along with the other documents I noted earlier. Once our board sets the final fees, we'll post them to our website. we will notify the participants in the consultation and in a number of different ways that the final fees have been posted. Like I mentioned, you will be receiving communications from us when it's time to start thinking about coming in to report your supply and pay your fee. The feedback that we get during the consultation, again, like I said earlier, will get summarized in a consultation report that will get posted along with the final fee schedule. And I think, Davina, I think that's it.
Yes, that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.